believe me, I can understand what it's like, especially in these stressful times, to have trouble sleeping. Maybe you're tossing and turning and you're trying to get yourself to sleep. And I'm sure you're looking for ways on how you can do that, how you can relax and get a good night's sleep. Well, let me tell you, if you're having trouble sleeping, the Deep Sleep Sounds podcast sounds like the show just for you. It's a podcast that uses quality binaural sounds to help you calm your mind and drift off to sleep. Whether it's rainstorms, calming birds, wind chimes, soothing music that you can sleep to, calming white noise, this podcast, the Deep Sleep Sounds podcast, aspires to help you sleep and relax and unwind. Listen to these soothing sounds designed to help you de-stress and get the rest you've been looking for by checking out the Deep Sleep Sounds podcast on Spotify or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast.
Finally tonight, as promised, a special comment on the Supreme Court's ruling today in the case Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission. On the cold morning of Friday, March 6, 1857, a very old man who was born just 8 months and 13 days after the Declaration of Independence was adopted, a man who was married to the sister of the man who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, a man who was enlightened enough to have freed his own slaves and given pensions to the ones who had become too old to work, read aloud in a reed-thin voice from a very long handwritten document. In it, he ruled on a legal case involving a slave brought by his owner to live in a free state, yet to remain a slave. The slave sought his freedom and sued, and looking back over legal precedent and the Constitution and the America in which it was created, this judge ruled that no black man could ever be considered an actual citizen of the United States. They had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far unfit that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. The case, of course, was Dred Scott. The old man was the 5th Chief Justice of the United States of America, Roger Brooke Taney. The outcome, he believed, would be to remove the burning question of abolition of slavery from the political arena for once and for all. The outcome, in fact, was the Civil War. No American ever made a single bigger misjudgment. No American ever carried the responsibility for the deaths and suffering of more Americans on his shoulders. No American was ever more quickly vilified. Within 4 years, Chief Justice Taney's rulings were being ignored in the South and the North. Within 5, President Lincoln, at minimum, contemplated arresting him. Within 7, he died in poverty while still Chief Justice. Within 8, Congress had voted to not place a bust of him alongside those of the other former Chief Justices. But good news tonight, Roger B. Taney is off the hook. Today, the Supreme Court of Chief Justice John Roberts, in a decision that might actually have more dire implications than Dred Scott v. Sanford, declared that because of the alchemy of its 19th century predecessors in deciding that corporations had all the rights of people, any restrictions on how these corporate beings spend their money on political advertising are unconstitutional. In short, the First Amendment, free speech for persons, which went into effect in 1791, applies to corporations, which were not recognized as the equivalents of persons until 1886. In short, there are now no checks on the ability of corporations or unions or other giant aggregations of power to decide our elections. None.
Welcome to The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Sunday, June the 21st, 2020. The voice you heard at the beginning of this episode was that of Keith Olbermann. That was from January the 21st, 2010. It was on a Friday on his program on MSNBC called Countdown with Keith Olbermann. And as you heard, what Keith was talking about there was Dred Scott. But he was also talking about Citizens United. And in this episode, the focus is the Supreme Court and its rulings on some cases that haven't really changed over the years. I'm going to look more closely at World War II and the Supreme Court ruling Korematsu versus the United States, and also look at the Supreme Court ruling just 2 years ago of Trump versus Hawaii, and why those cases are very, very similar. The focus, the U.S. Supreme Court, and those two decisions. Next. Welcome back. The original sin of America is the genocide of the Native Americans and the stealing of their land. The other original sin of America is the enslavement of black people for hundreds of years. These are the backdrops out of which the United States of America was born. These two things have never been adequately addressed. Never been adequately addressed or confronted throughout the almost 244 years of this country's existence. Into this atmosphere of denial and a failure to look squarely at the genocide of Native Americans and the stealing of their land. A genocide where close to, if not more than, 100 million Native Americans were murdered. We have the United States Supreme Court. And as you heard Keith Olbermann say, Dred Scott versus Sanford held that the white man has, let me just put it this way. The holding of that case was that black people had no rights, that the white man was bound to respect. And Dred Scott was the law, was the precedent in this country for many a year. Many a year. And as you heard Olbermann say, the case, which was ruled in 1857, and of course 1857 was literally just a few years, 4 years before the beginning of the Civil War. And Roger Taney, the Chief Justice, was one of the most racist people you would ever imagine. He was a stone-cold racist, as are many people still in this country. There's been Dred Scott, there's been Plessy versus Ferguson. There have been cases like those two that have been awful for the United States, to say the least, putting it mildly. And then there's a case like Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, where in 1954, that decision ruled that black people had a right to an equal access of education, and there needed to be a desegregation of the schools. And over the 1950s, these orders were being enforced, and there were people like Eisenhower, who was in power at the time in the 1950s, the mid-1950s, well, actually from 1951 onwards, and Eisenhower had won 2 terms, 1952 onwards, because Eisenhower had won 2 terms. Actually, he was sworn in 1953. But Dwight D. Eisenhower had won 2 terms in office as the Republican president. And he had to enforce executive orders to get an enforcement of the law of the land through the Brown versus Board of Education versus Topeka, Kansas decision. So there were literally National Guard being brought into places like Alabama, to Mississippi with Ole Miss and James Meredith to desegregate those schools and allow James Meredith, a black man, and to allow other black people to come in to integrate the schools or to desegregate them. We had high schools too, and I forget the lady's name, the young black woman, Margaret, I believe, has her first name, but I don't remember. And she was coming into such hostile abuse from the white students that she was in school with, in class with, and they spat at her, called her racist names, pulled at her. This was the most vile thing that was going on with those who had the temerity to just walk into a school as a black person, had the temerity to do that because the law had recognized their rights to exist and to get an education. And there were white people who were extremely hostile to that. To say the least, they were racist and violent. I want to just set that contextual introduction to what I am going to be talking about during this episode. So we had 1857. We had 1954. But before we got to 1954, we had World War II. And World War II for the United States began on December 7th, 1941, with the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japanese forces. Pearl Harbor located in Hawaii. And I am going to tie Hawaii back into all of this during the course of this episode. In 1941, December 7, 1941, the U.S. bases in the military fort and the bases of Pearl Harbor were attacked by the Japanese. And that was the event that brought the United States into World War II. At the time, FDR, who at this point was into his second term in office, at this point at least, toward the end of that second term, if my math serves me correctly, was the President of the United States. And one of the things he responded to, apart from deploying forces to fight against the Japanese and the Germans and the Italians, was to issue an executive order, and to issue Executive Order 9066. And Executive Order 9066, and this actually came about, this executive order, following the following February in 1942. And that was one of the earliest things he had done, was to issue an order that gave the military permission to designate areas of the country enforcement zones. I mean, these enforcement zones of requiring people to actually leave their homes. that they had to be enforcibly pushed out of their homes and report to concentration camps. Now, these military zones, these enforcement zones, were not necessarily at all attached to the Germans or the Italians. In fact, let me just say it straight out. These enforcement zones applied to one group and one group only. And that was the Japanese Americans. This was fully race-based. There's no question about it. And what happened with that order, and I will read to you just a portion of that order right now, that was given out by FDR, the Democratic president at the time. Don't forget that he was a Democrat, for those Republicans out there who I'm sure will love to gloat about it. But it's not about the partisanship, quite frankly. It's about what this government has done to various people based on race, whether it is black people, whether it is Japanese people, whether it is people who are African from the continent of Africa, or whether it is people who are of the Muslim faith. So this Executive Order 9066, which was issued on February 19th, 1942 by FDR, and we regard in this country, and history regards, Franklin Delano Roosevelt as one of the great presidents. I would actually say that he is one of the presidents who did some major things in this country. A Bill of Rights for the working class, the right to have a job, the right to have an education, the right to housing, the right to be able to have food, clean drinking water. Of course, a lot of these things are already, in this day and age, violated. We see what's happened in Flint. We see what's happened in Newark. We see what's happening with drinking water in any number of cities around the country. We see food banks all over this country now in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. And none of that's being talked about anymore, about the food banks that are ubiquitous across this country. People of all backgrounds waiting still in long, long lines all over this country for food. That is no longer being talked about in the media. Here's what I want to read from this order, Executive Order 9066 from FDR from February the 19th, 1942. I hereby further authorize and direct the Secretary of War and the said military commanders to take such other steps as he or the appropriate military commander may deem advisable to enforce compliance with the restrictions applicable to each military area here in above authorized to be designated. Let me change my tone of voice here. I hereby further authorize and direct the Secretary of War and the said military commanders to take such other steps as he or the other appropriate military commander may deem advisable to enforce compliance with the restrictions applicable to each military area here and above authorized to be designated, including the use of federal troops and other federal agencies with authority to accept assistance of state and local agencies. I hereby further authorize and direct all executive departments, independent establishments, and other federal agencies to assist the Secretary of War or the said military commanders in carrying out this executive order, including the furnishing of medical aid, hospitalization, food, clothing, transportation, use of land, shelter, and other supplies, equipment, utilities, facilities, and services. This order shall not be construed as modifying or limiting in any way the authority heretofore granted under Executive Order Number 8972, dated December 12, 1941, nor shall it be construed as limiting or modifying the duty and responsibility of the Federal Bureau of Investigation with respect to the investigation of alleged acts of sabotage, or the duty and responsibility of the Attorney General and the Department of Justice under the proclamations of December 7th and 8th, 1941, prescribing regulations for the conduct and control of alien enemies, except as such duty and responsibility is superseded by the designation of military areas hereunder. That was Franklin Delano Roosevelt from the White House. Executive Order 9066, February 19th, 1942. This order was an order that was very much at the heart of the Supreme Court case Korematsu against the United States. Korematsu had been something that Fred Korematsu, I believe is his name, an American citizen who was of Japanese descent, was a citizen convicted in a federal district court, of remaining in his home in San Leandro, California. And this was a military area, quote unquote. And this was actually in violation of a previous order, a civilian exclusion order. And this was something that the Executive Order 9066 that I just read a portion of gave the discretion of these military commanders, and these military commanders were white men, to, in their own discretion, to arbitrarily order whatever enforcement zones or exclusions they felt necessary to further their case of national security in these times of war. You know, that was what Executive Order 9066 from FDR did. So there was this civilian exclusion order, number 34, that a commander in the Western Command, the commanding general in the U.S. Army on these western shores here, the West Coast, California, specifically California, that directed that after May of 1942, particularly after May the 9th, actually, then this was just, 3 months after the Executive Order 9066 that FDR issued. 3 months later, you have this particular exclusion order that said that after May the 9th of 1942, all persons of Japanese ancestry should be excluded from this particular area, in this case, San Leandro. Now look, San Leandro has a long history of racism, like a lot of places, of course, all over the country do. I mean, this is something that should not be any shock to you. California is a state that is awash in racism, in lynching. We have obviously heard much, of course, we've heard of the fact that there are lynchings in California. We found, of course, recently the news of 2 black men who have been lynched here in California within 11 days of each other and within 45 or so miles of each other in Southern California. And so far now, the FBI is now investigating those two hangings. And I think they're both lynchings anyway, because it's very clear to me, black people do not do this to themselves. And if black people wanted to commit suicide, believe me, there would be other ways they would do it, particularly black men who would choose something quick and painless, i.e. a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Not hanging in a town square at 3:40 in the morning. But I digress. San Leandro has and still has a long history of racism and violence, racial violence, racist violence, violence against black people in particular, and against Japanese Americans. So this American, Fred Korematsu, I believe is his name, refused to leave his home. And this federal district order was telling him he had to leave. He had to leave. You had to leave your home. And he refused to do so. He absolutely refused to do so. And he took this all the way to the Supreme Court. Took this all the way to the Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court in this country said that this order, this executive order and this action against this Japanese American, this American, where he had to leave his home and go to a concentration camp. The same kinds, by the way. Germany had concentration camps at the very same time. And it was clear, quite frankly, that the Germans were imitating the Americans. Hitler got a lot of his ideas for these kinds of things from the United States. This Supreme Court decision that came down in 1944 in the Korematsu case, Fred Korematsu against the United States, it's called Korematsu versus the U.S., held, this is just unbelievable, but this happened, held that it was completely lawful for the military and the government, the federal government, FDR, to exclude Japanese Americans from the West Coast military areas during World War II. The Supreme Court upheld racism. And this was a 6-3 decision. This was not close. A 6-3 decision. This said that Japanese Americans could be discriminated against. Now, by the way, there was no justification for moving or forcing Fred Korematsu or anybody else to be forced into these areas, forced into these concentration camps. There was nothing that Fred Korematsu had done. He did not voice any kind of support for Emperor Hirohito, who was in power during that time. He'd been in power. His reign in Japan lasted some 60 to 63. His reign in power lasted 63 years in Japan, including that period during World War II. Fred Korematsu had never said anything supporting the emperor, even though he would have had a First Amendment right to do so, even during wartime. But he never did anything like that. He was an American living in his home in San Leandro, California. San Leandro is in the East Bay, not all that far away from Oakland, to give you some geographic perspective. And the Supreme Court said that the government was absolutely right to do what it did. Absolutely right to do what it did. Uphold racism and justify concentration camps for Japanese Americans, for Americans. Justification of concentration camps for Americans, for the citizens of your country. And this was flat out racist. It is flat out racist. The rancor, as you can imagine, was widespread. There was a strong dissent, some strong dissents on the Supreme Court. Those three justices on the United States Supreme Court at the time who dissented and did so very forcefully, quite frankly. And I think that it was good that they did, that somebody voiced strong opposition to this. Justice Jackson, Robert Jackson, was one of the dissenters. Making it a crime to simply be of a certain race is unconstitutional. Further, German American and Italian American citizens were not treated in the same fashion, only Japanese Americans. I mean, approving the military orders in this case will send a message that such military conduct is permissible in the future. The court does not need to make a military judgment as to whether the order was a military necessity, but it should not allow it under the Constitution. This was one of those decisions that I think was one, along with Dred Scott versus Sanford, these explicit supports of racism. It's one of the worst decisions. Plessy versus Ferguson and Korematsu versus the United States. One of the worst decisions, some of the worst decisions the United States Supreme Court has ever made. Ever made. I mean, this is something that was odious, to say the least. Justice Murphy had given a dissent as well. Justice Frank Murphy. And one of the things that Justice Frank Murphy had to say was, in his dissent, which was quite lengthy but very clear, was, quote, "I dissent, therefore, from this legalization of racism, racial discrimination." And this was 1944. The excuse, by the way, oh, this is wartime, this is national security, we have to do this. And there was nothing about Fred Korematsu that presented any kind of threat to national security. It was pure racist ideas and fervor on the part of a government controlled by white men and military controlled by white men who were racist. This is what Frank Murphy, Justice Frank Murphy, had to say partially in his dissent. "I dissent, therefore, from this legalization of racism. Racial discrimination in any form and in any degree has no justifiable part whatever in our democratic way of life. It is unattractive in any setting, but it is utterly revolting among a free people who have embraced the principles set forth in the Constitution of the United States. All residents of this nation are kin in some way by blood or culture to a foreign land. Yet they are primarily and necessarily a part of the new and distinct civilization of the United States. They must, accordingly, be treated at all times as the heirs of the American experiment and as entitled to all the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution. One of the things that Justice Murphy also put in his dissent was some really compelling evidence of the outright racism, the blatant and overt racism of the military, which at that time had not been desegregated. Truman, I believe in 1947 or 48, had issued the order to officially desegregate the military and allow black people to serve in it. This is the United States military I'm talking about. 1947 or 48. This is around the same time or the year after Jackie Robinson, who in 1947, April 15th of that year, became the first black person to play baseball in the Major League Baseball sport, MLB. He played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Further evidence. This is justice. I mean, this is really something. And you really have to listen to what I'm about to read. Justice Murphy put this piece of evidence in his dissent. For his dissent, in his dissent, articulating that this is just blatant racism. There is nothing, there's no justification for this military order. No justification whatsoever. And I'm going to read this. Further evidence of the commanding general's attitude toward individuals of Japanese ancestry is revealed in his voluntary testimony on April the 13th, 1943, in San Francisco, before the House Naval Affairs Subcommittee to investigate congested areas. Now look, this was in Congress. This is what he said. This is what a commanding general said. The commanding general. I don't have his name to hand here. This is in testimony in Congress before the House Naval Affairs Subcommittee to investigate congested areas. This testimony in San Francisco. Now, this may have been the California Congress, I would imagine, but still, quote, this is the commanding general. I don't want any of them, and it's a slur for people of Japanese descent, here. I don't want any of them here. They are a dangerous element. There is no way to determine their loyalty. The West Coast contains too many vital installations essential to the defense of the country to allow any Japanese on this coast. The danger of the Japanese was and is now, if they are permitted to come back, espionage and sabotage. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen. He is still a Japanese. American citizenship does not necessarily determine loyalty. I'm going to repeat that. American citizenship does not necessarily determine loyalty. What does, is my question. If American citizenship doesn't determine loyalty, then what the hell does? But that's my aside. I'm going to continue with the words of this commanding general. But we must worry about the Japanese all the time until he is wiped off the map. Sabotage and espionage will make problems as long as he is allowed in this area. End quote. Those were the words spoken in a congressional hearing in San Francisco, California, before the House Naval Affairs Subcommittee to investigate congested areas. April the 13th, 1943. Less than 80 years ago. This runs deep. I'm going to talk a bit more about what all this led to, plus some more background, in just a moment. Welcome back. There is a book I strongly recommend that you read. It's called The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. It's by Thom Hartmann, Thom is his first name, last name Hartmann, Hartm as in Mike, Ann. Thom Hartmann. Now, some of you may be familiar with who Thom Hartmann is. He is a progressive radio host. He's a historian. He has written many, many books on a number of subjects, including the Supreme Court, including the environment, including many matters. And I really think that you should listen to what he has to say. He can be found, by the way, on freespeech.org from Monday through Friday from 12 p.m. Eastern to 3 p.m. Eastern time. And on the West Coast, that's 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. Listen to his show. He does a show every day, Monday through Friday, for 3 hours. You will learn a lot. That is one thing to mention. And this book that he's done is a great book. And he goes into a lot about the enslavement in this country of black people. He talks about how, and I talked about this an episode or two ago, about how all of these things were written into the Constitution, the 3/5 compromise that I talked about. He goes into in detail in his book. And he also talks about a number of other things. That, of course, the country, and I've said this many times, was born into violence. This country's independence was achieved through violence, through enslavement, the enslavement of people, the enslavement specifically of black people, and the murders, the genocide of the Native American, stealing the Native American's land. Then fighting this American, quote-unquote, American Revolution. And that was born out of bloodshed, of course. Crispus Attucks, the first person to die in the Boston Massacre, was a black man. And yet, this was soon going to be, this is the thing. This is all during the time that black people had been enslaved. 1773, the United States of America was not born yet. Not officially. It was 1776 when independence was achieved. July the 4th, 1776. In 1773 was the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. So keep that in mind. And all the while, there were black people in chains. Black people were brought here in 1619. Some would say even earlier than that. There are authors that I have read on that would say in the 1500s, and maybe they are. Ivan van Sertima has a great book called They Came Before Columbus, which predates 1492, which talks about the African presence in ancient America. They Came Before Columbus, from Ivan van Sertima. It's a book that I highly recommend, by the way. But I want to get back to the subject of the Supreme Court and what this all led to. As I said, as a way of preface, we've had many Supreme Court decisions in this country, some of them very good, some of them very, very bad indeed. I talked about some of the good ones specifically Brown versus Board of Education. I've spoken about some of the horrible ones, like Korematsu versus the United States, like Dred Scott versus Sanford, like Plessy versus Ferguson. And Keith Olbermann was talking about Citizens United, which was a horrible decision as well. Now, he argued that the ramifications of it could be worse than Dred Scott. Well, I don't know that that's true, but I do know that I would actually disagree with Keith Olbermann there. But I do know that Citizens United certainly has extreme ramifications right now for what we're seeing in politics and in election money being spent and all kinds of things, foreign entities and countries throwing money in, and governments and representatives and corporations throwing as much money as they can at candidates. That is definitely something that has really hurt the United States of America and elections, to say the least. But what happened after Korematsu in 1944, when the United States Supreme Court said 6-3 decision? Meaning that 2/3 of the court said this is fine, this is okay, to just discriminate based on race. This is 1944. It's not that long ago at all. It's in our lifetimes. 1944. Not 1744, not 1544, not 1844, but 1944. The United States Supreme Court said that it was okay to be racist, it was okay to racially discriminate against Japanese people who are Americans, and it was okay to put them in concentration camps here inside the United States of America. And what's changed about that? Not a whole hell of a lot, when you consider that the Trump administration has caged hundreds, if not thousands, of brown men, women, and children in concentration camps along the southern border of this country. Right now, right here in 2020. Things haven't changed that much. But Korematsu was just the tip of the iceberg in 1944. Because less, and I mean literally, 8 months, less than a year, 8 months after Korematsu came along, we had this.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July the 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware. We have spent more than $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and we have won. But the greatest marvel is not the size of the enterprise, its secrecy, or its cost, but the achievement of scientific brains in making it work. And hardly less marvelous has been the capacity of industry to design the machines and methods to do things never done before. Both science and industry work together under the direction of the United States Army, which achieved a unique success in an amazingly short time. It is doubtful if such another combination could be got together in the world. What has been done is the greatest achievement of organized science in history.
That was President Harry Truman on August the 6th, 1945. He was speaking right after he dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima in Japan. A nuclear bomb that actually killed more than 200,000 people at minimum in Hiroshima, Japan. The vast majority of over 200,000 people that were killed there were civilians. And this was President Truman glowing about this great success. There was no great success. This was Truman glowing about, well, we have won. What have you won when you bomb and kill over 200,000 civilians in Hiroshima? What exactly have you won? That whole city was leveled. And the estimates of the number of people killed actually is way north of 200,000 people. 3 days later, another nuclear bomb would be dropped, and it would be dropped on the city of Nagasaki. At least 200,000 people killed there. And these are estimates that I would say are low. Very few of the people killed there were soldiers. The overwhelming majority, over 90% of the people killed, were civilians. The United States is the only country on earth that has used nuclear weapons in armed conflict. The only one. The only one that's dropped nuclear bombs during a conflict. By the way, this had support in the United Kingdom. The government of the United Kingdom supported this. That would be Mr. Winston Churchill. So we went from Korematsu in 1944 saying, you know what, Japanese people who are Americans of American descent, of Japanese descent, Americans of Japanese descent have to go to a concentration camp. And as odious as that is, to destroying a people on their land who are civilians. Up to 500,000 Japanese people killed in the space of 3 days, 4 days. Some died weeks and months later. But the point is that up to 500,000 people, 500,000 plus people in Japan were killed when the United States of America dropped nuclear bombs on 2 of their cities, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's what this racism and hatred led to. Mass murder. I'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. So we fast forward from the events of 1944 and of 1945 to the events of 2018. It should be said that in 1983, well, it should be said that in 1983, a California district court had voided the conviction of Fred Korematsu and had made that conviction voided on the grounds that there was a Solicitor General who had suppressed a report from the Office of Naval Intelligence at the time that had held that there was no evidence at all that Japanese Americans were acting as spies for Japan. As I said earlier, nothing about Fred Korematsu had or would have given any reason for the U.S. military or for FDR to believe that he was a danger to the United States. He's an American. Just like the peaceful protesters who were tear gassed at the beginning of this month were Americans, are Americans. There was nothing about them that would have given any justification for Donald Trump to order them to be tear gassed. They were peaceful. They were protesting police brutality. And what did they get? Police brutality against them. So this Solicitor General, I forget his name. I don't know if his name is Charles somebody, Fahey or something. He had suppressed a report from the Office of Naval Intelligence, and in that report from the ONI, they had held that there was no evidence that Japanese Americans were acting as spies for Japan. None. So the California District Court in 1983 had voided this conviction that Korematsu had for daring to stay in his home and not go into a concentration camp in San Leandro, or in San Francisco for that matter. Hundreds of thousands, by the way, of Americans of Japanese descent were held in these concentration camps in the 40s and a little bit, I think, into the 50s as well. But the point is that hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans, again, hundreds of thousands of Americans were held in these concentration camps in this country, in California, and in various other places, I might add, in this country. The Japanese Americans who were interned in these concentration camps were given reparations or granted reparations in 1988 through a Civil Liberties Act. Native Americans still have not received any kind of reparations of any meaningful measure for the genocide of over 100 million Native Americans and for the stealing of their land by white men. They still have not received any form of reparations. Black people in this country have not received any form of reparations whatsoever to this very day for more than 400 years of enslavement and racism. There has not been a single dime given to black people in this country, African Americans in this country, for the centuries of enslavement. Not a dime. Trump versus Hawaii was decided on June the 26th, 2018. Now this is coming up, the 2-year mark of this is coming up very, very soon, 5 days from now. And this was the case of the travel ban. This was that case. And the Supreme Court said this. The Supreme Court just 2 years ago now, short of 5 days of exactly 2 years ago, ruled 5-4 that Donald Trump had the authority to issue this ban on people from Muslim countries. And there were at least 7 countries that were on this list of travel ban. Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Yemen. And this is regardless of their visa status, no matter what. The citizens of these 7 countries were not allowed in to the United States. And for at least several months, if not more. There was all this additional kind of scrutiny, all these hoops that people from these countries had to jump through before they could even have a chance to possibly come to this country, to travel here. And the Supreme Court completely said, that's okay. You can do it. And what was really sick about this, in an ironic way, beyond the obvious decision, was that they actually condemned Korematsu. When this court in 2018 was doing exactly what the Korematsu court was doing. And what the Korematsu court was doing was giving all this power to the executive branch. They were saying that the president had full power to do this, whether it was with Roosevelt's executive order of 9066 in February of 1942, or whether it was Donald Trump in 2017 with his executive orders, issuing these bans. And these bans were clearly Islamophobic, anti-Muslim bans. It didn't prevent white residents from coming. It didn't prevent any of that. It was all about Muslims. You can't come in here. That's what Trump versus Hawaii was about. That's what these travel bans were about. Justice Sotomayor, who is one of the dissenters in this 5-4 decision, said that the decision made by Chief Justice John Roberts was really one that was the same in kind as Korematsu, using the same kind of reasoning. As I just said, that the president had the right to do this because his discretion is unfettered here. Replacing one gravely wrong decision with another, Justice Sotomayor said in part in her dissent to this case less than 2 years ago, or almost 2 years ago now. It's really striking to me, and yet not surprising at all, that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And there are historians that say, well, history does not repeat itself, but it's instructive. Well, I beg to differ slightly. I would agree that history is instructive, but I would also say that history does repeat itself. Certainly the atmospherics of it do. Certainly the processes of it do. Because we're seeing now in the United States very many of the same kinds of things we saw in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and in the 1940s. We're seeing fascism in the United States of America. We're seeing these things. These things are repeating. And we have to make sure that this November, we put a stop to all of this. There is a movement now, the Black Lives Matter movement, that is doing its part to make some structural changes, to force that, to get rid of a system that has been baked into racist dogma, fear, and hate, and racial discrimination and oppression and violence. And it's being embodied by police forces. And the Supreme Court has played a large role in upholding a lot of it as a big institution in this country. We have to really look at what institutions are doing. And yes, we do have to defend institutions, but we do not have to defend the decisions that they make when it comes to discriminating against a class of people, a group of people. And as I may have alluded to earlier, but I will certainly repeat it here. Even in this context, just last week, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the LGBTQ community cannot be fired based on their sex or identity. And it was a 6-3 decision. And Chief Justice Roberts, the very same Chief Justice who in 2013 ruled that that the Voting Rights Act, Section 4, could be scrapped in the Shelby versus Holder decision, the very same Chief Justice who in Trump versus Hawaii said, oh no, Donald Trump has the discretion as the executive and the unitary executive that I talked about in the previous episode to do what he wants about this travel ban. The very same Chief Justice Roberts said that the United States Supreme Court, and in his decision, that employers could not discriminate against the LGBTQ community solely based on their identity or their sex. These are protected classes. And two conservatives, Chief Justice Roberts and Neil Gorsuch, a Trump appointee. Gorsuch, you remember, was the Supreme Court justice who should never really have been there because, of course, Merrick Garland had been denied a hearing for almost a year in the final year of Obama's presidency. You remember all of that in 2016, where Mitch McConnell declined to do his duty. By the way, violated the Constitution when he refused a hearing for Merrick Garland, Barack Obama's pick for the Supreme Court. Now, again, that was a 6-3 decision on the end of discrimination against the LGBTQ community. And then the other Supreme Court decision last week was the one that the court voted 5-4 to uphold DACA protections and ruled that Trump cannot deport DACA recipients, people who were protected under President Obama's immigration protection program. Very, very interesting decisions. I mean, good decisions, but very, very interesting in the context of what I've been talking about here. Korematsu in 1944. What happened, of course, with the outright murder of hundreds of thousands of Japanese people, civilians, in 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then these decisions in the Supreme Court just 2 years ago in Trump versus Hawaii. Hawaii, by the way, is one of those states that still does not recognize Juneteenth, may I add, as a holiday of any kind or even an observance of any kind. Let me just put that out there. But it's interesting that we go from Korematsu in 1944 to a decision like Shelby versus Holder in 2013, no less in a different discipline, but all dealing with the issues of race. As we then go to Trump versus Hawaii in 2018, dealing with the issue of faith, Muslim faith, and Donald Trump banning Muslims of countries, they're all predominantly Muslim countries, those countries I mentioned earlier, from entering the United States. A travel ban against them. And the court doing some of the very same things that the Supreme Court back in 1944 did in Korematsu. And then just last week, the very same Supreme Court except for Kavanaugh, who was still not yet on the court, I believe, at that time. But maybe he was. But anyway, the court last week saying no more discrimination against gay people by their workplaces. And the court saying DACA recipients can be protected. You cannot deport them, Donald. You can't do it. These decisions are remarkable decisions. Where is the Supreme Court going from here? I guess that's going to be a question that I will be examining, and we'll be getting some help in examining that in a future episode. But for now, thank you very much for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.